Are you on? It's going to be a long night.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Well, welcome to the Armorbird Gallery. We're glad to have you here at the University of Charleston. I'm Ed Welch, president of the university. This is another conversation on energy. This is the third in a series of 5 of those conversations. The next one will be on Tuesday night, March the 27th. And our guest will be Kevin Crutchfield, who is the CEO of Alpha Natural Resources, which is a major coal company. There might be some different answers at the next session than this session, but we'll do that comparison and see how that comes out. Thanks again to Jim Guidarini and Dow Chemical Foundation that has funded and supported our speaker series for more than a decade. We appreciate that. We do questions, so if you have, I hope, some pieces of paper, and if you want to write questions, you can pass them to the center or the end. There are some paper there. There are pencils around. We don't ask those questions, but you get to write them. See if you're listening. No, we really do, and make sure that to ask whatever it is that you are interested in after I get to do the intro part. And I encourage you to turn off your noisemakers so they don't interrupt with what it is that we're talking about and the exchange. Our guest tonight is David Porges. He is a native of Chicago. He earned his bachelor's degree in industrial engineering and management science at Northwestern. He just told me that after Northwestern, he had the option to go to either Stanford or Harvard for his MBA and chose Stanford. You can decide whether you think that was a really smart idea or not, but it's done well by him. He worked at EQT Corporation in 2 foreign countries, Australia and Texas. Are they listening? Yeah, they are. Okay. Then was at Bankers Trust Corporation as an associate in their energy group, was promoted to vice president and then managing director. He joined EQT in July of 1998 as a senior VP and CFO. He became president and CEO in 2010, and a year ago, became also the chair of the board at EQT. He is very active in the community, serves on many boards, and EQT is a philanthropic company giving back to their community. EQT has operations in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Maryland? Virginia. How'd you miss Maryland? Virginia, right. There are 2 major subdivisions. One of those is production, and then another that is responsible for pipelines and storage and processing plants. So that's a word about EQT. You came down, you had a conversation with the governor today. Any little tidbits to share about the conversation with the governor, or is that for future information?
Well, that should really be left to the governor, obviously.
That's politic.
But my impression is that he looks for, he's trying to gather information on what kinds of things the state can do to take advantage of its natural resources. So my impression, he's kind of in learning mode. He talks to a whole bunch of people to see if he can learn as much as he can.
Okay. Let's then get into one of the big things that's of interest here, and we do produce a little bit of coal in this state, as well as also having some natural gas. What would you want to articulate to us as being the advantages of natural gas vis-a-vis coal?
Especially today, it's actually a little bit less expensive than coal. That has not normally been the case, but of late that has been the case. And the emissions from natural gas burns cleaner. It burns cleaner than other fossil fuels. And I'm not just talking about greenhouse gases, but natural gas has less of the so-called NOx and SOx. Those are nitrous oxides and sulfuric oxides, less particulate matter, therefore less matter that produces smog and air quality problems. But we don't necessarily view coal as being a competitor. I think the reality that we need to deal with as a country, and West Virginia needs to deal with as a state, is that all of the forms of energy have pros and cons. And I think for a lot of us have probably become very aware of some of the negatives associated with coal, because that gets talked about a lot. Negatives associated with natural gas have been talked about more recently. But the reality is there's trade-offs involved with wind and with solar and with geothermal. I think the events in Japan a while back made us more aware again of some of the downsides associated with nuclear. I think the mistake any of us would make is to think that there's some magic fuel that has no downsides. All industrial activity and all of our consumption choices involve trade-offs. And they are somewhat different trade-offs for coal than for natural gas and for wind and for solar. But there are trade-offs nonetheless with all of those.
Well, the big picture is that people think that the use of coal is decreasing, the use of natural gas is going to increase, and one of the forecasts I saw is that between now and 2035, 80% of the new electricity generation will come from natural gas instead of coal. And so that would suggest that over some period of time there is this seismic shift, if I can use that word, from a dependence on coal to more on natural gas. I mean, do you think that that's what's happening?
Well, actually, the reports that I have seen suggest that even though the use of natural gas in power generation is growing, that over the next 20 to 30 years, it's only expected to increase its share of the overall power generation fuel mix by 1 percentage point or maybe 2. And that even though it would appear to us when we hear reports of the power utilities, the power generation firms shutting down a coal plant, or they announce they will do that and they will build a natural gas plant. So we get the impression that's the shift. Right. When you look at the big picture, kind of how the pie, as it were, changes from now on to 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it really seems more as if it's renewables that are replacing coal, that natural gas is staying relatively constant in the analyses that I've seen. Now, of course, what was it? Was it Mark Twain who said it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future?
Yeah, right.
And I think that probably applies to this as well.
Well, that means it's safe to make them, because yours is as good as anybody else's, and we'll.
I find the older I get, the more comfortable I am making predictions about the far future, since I won't be around.
Yeah. Global warming, climate change. Do you believe the data that suggests that something really is happening there, and if so, that human beings have something to do with that?
Okay, so we're going to stay with the non-controversial gas
versus coal. We're going to start off non-controversial, and then we'll come back. And one of the claims is that natural gas is one of the answers to reducing this problem of CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases.
Well, first of all, I certainly don't know whether the Earth is in a long-term warming trend or not. I think from what I've seen, a lot of the data suggests that it's probably warming some, even though I understand it really hasn't warmed for the last decade. But there's so much variability in weather that one has to look over a very long term to get a sense of climate. And I'm somewhat sympathetic to the argument that if we believe that something may be extremely dangerous, catastrophic, and we're not sure, and we can find relatively low-cost means of averting the danger, then it makes sense to do so. Because you've got the separate issues, and I think separable issues, of whether the globe is warming, and if it is, how much humans have to do with it. And then if humans do have something to do with it, to what extent should we mitigate, and to what extent should we adapt? Right. Because, of course, in fact, things are a lot colder now than they were at some points in our past, and they're a lot warmer than they were at other points in our past. But still, when there's one becomes convinced that there's a reasonable probability of something catastrophic and one can do something about it, then I think that's great. I think the other question is, are the things that we're choosing to do about it actually doing something about it or just costing money? Yeah. So I tend not to be a big proponent of using natural gas instead of coal because of climate change. I think there are better reasons to use more natural gas, and they happen to result in less greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. I think the thing that we live with all the time, and I'm actually involved in a project at the request of a philanthropic organization up in Pittsburgh about air quality in that area. And I think natural gas offers a lot in terms of air quality benefits, so that you might say, well, I can pick up some greenhouse gas benefits at the same time as we're getting down the road at the same time as we're getting air quality benefits now. And I tend to view that as being a better argument in favor of using natural gas or increasing the amount of natural gas. But if we really think that it is CO2 that is, if we wind up becoming convinced that that's what's will drive a warmer climate, then we are going to have to figure out a way to get the energy we need without creating greenhouse gases. So from that perspective, natural gas could be a bridge fuel, but of course, again, we're talking about climate, so we're talking about many, many decades, right? And perhaps longer than decades. So a bridge fuel that lasts 30 or 50 or 75 years, that might, in the overall scheme of things, really truly look like a bridge fuel. But at some point, if that's the case, we're going to need to eliminate those carbon emissions. And again, you look at wind, solar, et cetera. As I've actually like to say, the wind and the sun are renewable, but the turbines and the solar panels are not. They get manufactured. They go through a manufacturing process. Right. There's a carbon footprint associated with that manufacturing process. So again, there's pros and cons. I just don't tend to believe in the absolutes that one form of energy is good and the others are evil. I'm sure we can come up with evil ones, but I don't think any of the ones that we've discussed this evening are evil forms of energy.
As some people here know, 2 weeks ago we had a speaker who had no doubt about whether we were getting warmer and what all of that meant. So.
And which way was his certainty, though? Because I've actually met plenty of people who have no doubt. They just don't agree with each other. That's the problem I've got.
We'll go back to gas.
Okay.
What is the Marcellus Shale? What's a shale? How big is this reserve? How significant is all this Marcellus stuff that we read about?
Well, a shale is what any of you who misspent your youth in pool halls would know of as a very dense rock. It's the same thing. It doesn't just happen to use the same word. It's an extremely dense rock. And if you ever held some up, you would probably be amazed. If you didn't have the background in geology, I actually don't have the background in geology, I hold it up and look at it and say, there's natural gas in here, really? It doesn't look like there could be natural gas in there. But I tend to think of it in terms of it's as if it were an extremely dense sponge. And that what you were talking about is water in the sponge as opposed to natural gas in the sponge. But it's extremely dense sponge that has some water in it, only it's not dripping. You can just see that it's moist maybe, but you have to apply some pressure to get that water to leave the sponge, and you have to do the same thing to get the natural gas out of the shale. Okay. The resource has been here obviously for a very, very, very long time. It wasn't placed here by anyone save the Almighty. I mean, it's been here for many millennia, and we've known for a long time, the scientists have known for a long time, that there are hydrocarbons inside that shale. But also for a very long time, really from the time that we knew there were hydrocarbons there until probably about a decade ago or less, maybe more like a half a decade, we thought that it was now and probably always would be uneconomical to extract that natural gas from that very dense rock. And then a couple of technologies, one of which was being experimented with, well, actually both of which were being experimented with over the last many decades, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, both began getting used in conjunction with each other to more economically extract the natural gas from the shale. And that's why these estimates of natural gas abundance in the United States have grown really over the past few years to the point where we now think we have certainly north of a century of this resource.
Yeah. I read someplace that EQT is one of the pioneers, champions of horizontal drilling. It's fascinating to me that you can dig a well down in the earth and make a right-hand turn in it somehow and go sideways.
The technology is amazing. I mean, if you ever get a chance to see those, and we do give tours, it is amazing the extent to which this technology has evolved. I mean, even though there's more discussion in the popular press about hydraulic fracturing, the more fascinating technology is horizontal drilling.
What's the significance of it? Why is it so good?
Well, the shale is typically someplace between 100 and, say, 500 feet thick, but it's between 5,000 and 10,000 feet below the Earth's surface. But it's not like a layer cake, where you go down the certain distance and then you just stay in that layer. I mean, I think it's obvious, even if you thought of it as a layer cake, that what you'd rather do, instead of punching many 1.5-mile vertical holes just to get, let's call it a 300-foot section that's productive for natural gas, you'd rather drill 1.5 mile vertical hole or well, and then in our case the average lateral length, so the horizontal length, is probably around 4,000, 4,500 feet, so it's getting close to a mile. So for every, in that case, you can just, I'm sure if you had some, I don't see many students here, but if they did the math, they would say, well, you know, if the horizontal or the vertical drilling, you're winding up getting 300 feet of pay, and the total amount the well's been drilled, let's say if it's 1.5 miles, is pushing 8,000 feet. So what's the ratio there? If you're drilling horizontally, you're drilling, let's say, 1.5 miles down, and we have drilled many wells that are beyond 1 mile, so let's say 1 mile out, well then 40% of the, I'm doing my math right, 1 over 2.5, so 40% of the length of the well bore is in areas that are prospective for natural gas. So I think if you think of it that way, you think, well, okay, now it's obvious that it's more economical. But the Earth doesn't behave like a layer cake. And actually, I would expect anybody who's a resident of West Virginia grasp that readily. Right. It undulates. So when we say 4,000 to 10,000, you say, well, you say it's the Marcellus Shale, but how could it be 4,000 to 10,000? It moves. I mean, as we go from east to west, it gets shallower and thins out, but all along the way, it is going up and down. So then it's in that context that I think you'd say, well, geez, how would you organize? Let's say you had a layer cake, except somebody's got undulations throughout it, and you've stuck let's say a long pipe cleaner into it, and you got it to turn the corner. How do you keep it in the layer? Getting it in there to start with, you could probably figure out how that could happen, but how do you keep it in there? And that's the technology that has really developed over the last few years. And I'd say there more than hydraulic fracturing is where EQT thinks that we're a leader, because we began using, even though others began using horizontal drilling many years before us, we started applying it in southern West Virginia in a different shale called the Huron Shale a few years before we began using it in the Marcellus, and we became very good at executing against that horizontal drilling. So that's, for those of us in the industry, it's a little ironic that the focus in technology is on one technique, which realistically is a technique that the oil field service companies, the Halliburtons of the world, are really more of the experts in. And the stuff that we're more proud of is the horizontal portion of it.
And as a result of this technology, my understanding is that producing natural gas from the Marcellus Shale is more economically viable and better for you than some other areas where we have natural gas. And so there's hence the concentration of work of how quickly can you gear up and take advantage of this. One of the quotes was that the Marcellus Shale may be to the United States what oil is to Saudi Arabia. Is that exaggerated?
Well,
or is it in the ballpark?
If you just talk about the total resource, arguably have more natural gas, not the Marcellus Shale, now if you take all of the natural gas in the United States, more natural gas than Saudi Arabia has oil. But realistically, I don't know if you've been to Saudi Arabia, I've been there a couple of times, there's not much, I mean, no offense, I hope we don't have any Saudi, I don't mean to offend any Saudis we might have in the audience, but there's not a lot there other than the oil reserves that are deep under the ground. So, and it was really what Bedouins back even in the 40s, right? As recently as the 40s, it was nomads. They just couldn't support much life. It was like being in a desert, you know. So oil transformed Saudi Arabia, as it did some of the other countries, and it's probably the same is true of Kuwait. I mean, Iran had a flourishing society going back many thousands of years, and some of the other countries did as well, but not Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia was a pretty desolate place. You know, if it gets to if the high in the summer in most places of Saudi Arabia is 100 degrees, you're thinking about global cooling.
Right.
I mean, it's not that pleasant. So no, I think that is an exaggeration. Oil transformed Saudi Arabia in a way that no natural resource is going to transform the United States.
Your challenges are getting it out. And so fracking has become a controversial issue for some. You have to put water down water and some other chemicals down in the ground to get this sponge to give up the natural gas. Then there are byproducts when you bring it up, and people are worried about that, not to mention some people are now worried about whether you're going to be causing earthquakes. And there was a company in England that said they thought that their drilling did cause some earthquakes. How do you deal with these fears about the water and the chemicals being released into the groundwater and fears about earthquakes?
Well, let's take the earthquakes first, because I think that's dealt with quite easily. In this country, there are, first of all, the earthquakes people are talking about are very low magnitude, right? 2 or 3 on the Richter scale. Right. And I have a feeling there's a lot of people in the country who don't realize that there are dozens of such earthquakes every single day in this country. They just don't get reported. That's what the Earth does. That said, if some aspect of any activity, and in our case it isn't really the drilling, it's what they're worried about is in certain sensitive areas seismically, it's the storage of the water that comes back, that storage is increasing pressures and is causing some of these tremors.
Or it might lubricate the where the rocks come together, and so it's easier for the Earth to shift.
Yeah, but if that's the case, that's a good thing, right? If you talk to a seismologist, they'd say if you could do something that would cause the plates to move gently against each other, that's not what we think of when we think of major earthquakes. It's when it doesn't move and doesn't move and doesn't move, and then there's a tremendous move. It finally gives way. But still, if there's a sensitive area seismically, we simply shouldn't be engaged in whatever that activity is. In this case, it would be the storage, but we shouldn't be engaged in that activity. Just as with geothermal, they found what was it they announced, was it last year I think only, that there's certainly areas of California where the geothermal power, the activity involved in getting geothermal energy was causing quite a bit larger earthquakes, and they decided, well, then let's not go for geothermal there. And the same thing should be true with all of these energy sources. If there are areas where it's seismically sensitive, well, we just shouldn't be doing things there. My view is I really do believe in the abundance of natural gas, and anybody who really does believe in it would also think, well, if there's areas that are particularly sensitive, just don't go after those, and there'll be plenty of years and in fact decades to be utilizing this resource and be moving up the learning curve. And then if we get more comfortable that we can engage in those activities, then that's fine. But if that increased knowledge makes us think, well, we shouldn't, well, then we won't. So I think that's relatively easily dealt with. issue of the chemicals involved in hydraulic fracturing is one where I do think it's been overstated. Folks are still asking that we disclose the data, but we have been. There's a website called fracfocus.org, and dozens of companies post individual information on individual well locations, so you can look that up. It's run by the Groundwater Protection, GWPC, Groundwater Protection something, but Society Council, Groundwater Protection Council, I think it is. And they're the ones who manage the website, and they've actually just announced that they're updating it to make it easier to upload information so that the public can use it. We've long been required to post that information at the individual well sites for states to use, so that information is available. And the chemicals that are used are ones that are found in everyday life. So the question arises, would you want to drink those? Well, no, but there's lots of things in your house, I would imagine, that you don't want to drink either. And yet, a lot of those things that you don't want to drink, including dishwasher liquid and soaps and stuff, find their way into your sink, and nobody seems, well, where does that go? Right? But that gets poured into the water supply, and we have such tiny concentrations, and the vast majority even of that 0.3% that is chemical has got nothing to do with any of that. As for instance, the elements that you use to make ice cream. So if somebody's concern is, well, wait, you might be putting a scoop of ice cream in my water. Well, okay, but anybody who empties out their ice cream, if you don't finish the ice cream at home and you put it down the sink, you're doing the same thing. So if you're concerned about that too, then I think that's fair, but I'm not sure why we'd be so concerned that it's this activity. The more troubling, still, full disclosure, I agree with that. If any activity that is telling the public they shouldn't be worried should also be fully transparent so the public can make its own determination. I agree wholeheartedly with that notion. The issue of what comes back pertains to what are referred to as naturally occurring radioactive material, or NORM. NORM occurs in that rock. It's naturally occurring, hence the name, and it's in the rock, and what happens is the water, which is a good carrier for really the sand, which is it's water and sand, and the whole point of the activity of hydraulic fracturing, you're not trying to get water down there as much as you're trying to get water and sand down there, and the chemicals are antibacterial in nature so that the water doesn't create bacteria and things like that. So the water is a good carrier for that, but it also means the water is a good carrier for the naturally occurring radioactive material. So there's a short-term and a long-term solution. The short-term solution, which is what's being used now, is to make sure that that water is handled very carefully, that the water management is done in a very careful manner, and that there be regulations surrounding its use, and that it be recycled, and we recycle well more than 90% of that water. So it goes back into the earth, and that to the extent that you have some left over, that is what goes into these disposal wells. And that, I think, has to be managed properly, and there have to be regulations around it. I believe there are. There were some scares about, actually up in Pennsylvania, there were folks saying that it was certain that we were having naturally occurring radioactive material in the water supply.
Well, EPA got in the middle of this someplace.
Well, they actually said that they were sure it was happening in western Pennsylvania. So then they looked at it in western Pennsylvania, and it just wasn't true. And Lisa Jackson said it wasn't true. So that's the issue with NORM. There is another risk you didn't raise that has to do with water integrity also. And that's if a well is constructed poorly, there is the possibility of breaching the aquifer on the way down. And we use a variety of methods, triple casing, et cetera, so really putting extra layers down to make sure it doesn't happen. But we really do need to make sure that the regulations around that activity also are enforced. West Virginia has such regulations. Pennsylvania has such regulations. They do work. There need to be enough inspectors, but again, as there needs to be for all industrial activity, whether it's natural gas drilling, coal mining, generation of wind power, solar power, et cetera. There are risks with all of those. We need to have well thought through regulations. And then I think it should be the industry itself that is funding that indirectly. Now, we did obviously as a country learn one of the mistakes of having the industry fund it directly, right? That one of the things that came out of the Macondo well situation in the Gulf of Mexico was that the Minerals Management Service, the MMS, isn't subjected to normal congressional review. It wound out, or wasn't, because it didn't need money from Congress because its money came from the industry. And I think that's probably not a healthy thing to do. It's better for the money to come from severance tax, or in the case of Pennsylvania, impact fees, and it goes, or permit fees, because both West Virginia and Pennsylvania have those as well. They've just been increased dramatically in West Virginia, well permit fees. And then the money should go into the state in such a way that it will fund the regulatory agencies, but not so that the regulatory agencies are subject to, I think the term of art is industry capture or industrial capture, so that they become too in bed with the folks that they're regulating. So the money has to come in, I think, because I believe that all industrial activities should pay for their own externalities, okay, including natural gas, obviously.
Let me go through a couple of other things. One is one of the components of natural gas is methane, which is
it's the main component, yeah.
Yes, which by itself is not a very friendly gas. So how do you deal with it to avoid the leakage of methane? And is it sufficient if you to try to burn some of that off, or what do you do?
Well, burning it off or flaring it turns the methane into CO2. Right. But if you're worried about CO2, that's not, even though that's better than methane leaking out, what you really want to do is to capture the methane. And whether it's in a pipeline or at the well site, that's the solution to not leaking methane is to not leak methane. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's plenty of things, plenty of substances that we don't just want to spill into the soil or into the air, et cetera, and methane is one of those. Let's face it, it's commercially viable. That is what you burn in your house for natural gas, if you have natural gas heating, or on your stove, et cetera. And I don't think we'd be encouraging anyone to just turn the natural gas on your stove either, and just let it leak away. Not necessarily because of the greenhouse gas effect. Right. Because it's, I mean, the benefit of methane is that it's combustible. That's why we like it. So, but it also means it has to be treated with care.
Okay, we've talked a bit about extraction. What about the transportation of gas? How do you get it from one place to another? Is it primarily through liquefying it? Or
No, primarily through pipelines. It's pipelines. Yeah, I know there's been a lot of discussion in West Virginia about ethane, but really when we think natural gas, it is methane. And methane is the simplest hydrocarbon. It's a molecule that is one atom of carbon and 4 atoms of hydrogen, so CH4. The next step up in hydrocarbons is ethane, which is C2H6. And that's still gaseous, but as you get more into the next level up, the next one up, C3H8, is propane, and then butane, and natural gasoline. So those are all components. They can all be components of natural gas as it comes out of the ground, but mainly what we're using as natural gas in homes, power generation facilities, et cetera, is methane, the simplest hydrocarbon. And that moves through pipelines entirely. Mm-hmm. If you wish to move it long distances across water, and of course then you can't afford a pipeline, then you will liquefy it by reducing the temperature. Well, the way you would liquefy any gas, you would either subject it to extreme pressure or you would reduce the temperature tremendously.
Okay. What's a cracker, and is there any chance of West Virginia getting a cracker?
A cracker is a small food item that
yeah,
you would
right.
typically
I
have.
think it's also something else about ethane and ethanol.
Well, yes, in the conversation that is going on in West Virginia right now, when they say cracker, which incidentally in different areas of the energy business could mean different things, they do mean an ethane cracker. And so ethane, which we just mentioned, would get changed molecularly in that ethane cracker to create ethylene. and then the ethylene winds up getting used. The ethylene is really the primary building block of the modern petrochemical business. Polyethylenes, et cetera. There's plenty of things. If these are glass, it wouldn't be true, but if they were plastic glasses, they would use it. The coverings for these are treated with them. There's an endless supply of things just around this room that use ethylene as a primary building block. There are no petrochemical facilities in this part of the country, so there is more ethane supply already than there is demand, so it winds up getting blended into the methane, so part of the natural gas stream, and sold as natural gas, which is not a very high value use for it. Mm-hmm. In the Gulf of Mexico and in other countries, they strip the ethane out using a processing plant, and they send the ethane to an ethane cracker, and it goes into the petrochemical complex, and you make much higher value added products out of it. So as one increases the production of the so-called wet gas, that is the gas that's got, instead of just methane, which is dry gas, it has ethane, propane, butane, natural gas liquids. That's called wet gas. As you produce more of that, as is beginning to happen in northern West Virginia now, you run even though there's plenty of uses for propane and butane, you start running into problems of having too much ethane, so you can't blend it into the natural gas. So it means you either have to build pipelines to ship it to places like the Gulf Coast or to the petrochemical complexes in Canada, a place called Sarnia, or you figure out a way to use it here. And historically, the best way for a community, a state, a county, a municipality, to take advantage of inexpensive raw materials is to utilize it for other higher value added activities. And so that's really the reason for that discussion. So it doesn't really help the production companies very much, but it does help the state. It is a way for the state and the region to take advantage of this resource. And frankly, from our, if you say, selfish perspective, the real benefit of having an ethane cracker here would be that there are, if you will, more winners. We think we are advantaged as an industry if more folks see that they are getting benefits. We already believe that the population at large is getting a lot of benefits from this abundance of natural gas, but the more benefits, the more jobs, et cetera, that come out of it, then the lower the bills are, the home heating bills, the electricity bills, more people get to share in the benefit as opposed to having a few people share. I mean, realistically, industries don't last very long unless they're most industries don't last very long if it's the few, just a few benefiting and the rest of the folks don't benefit.
I've heard it said that as people age, they're more willing to make forecasts about the future.
I'll have to be a good deal older than I am now for that to be true.
Well, we're going to try it anyway. Will West Virginia get a cracker?
I hope so. How about that?
So it's not a sure bet anyway,
no,
shape, or form.
but we're just, I mean, again, we're just a supplier. We would be a supplier to that. So, and I understand the one that's being talked about most, or one of the ones being talked about a lot in the papers, and that's where I'm getting my information, is Shell. And Shell is certainly talking to the state of West Virginia and also speaking to Pennsylvania and Ohio. But they're not really speaking to the natural gas production companies because I think their view is they already know what the ethane supply looks like. I used to work for a major oil company. They don't feel they need the smaller energy companies to help them figure out how much of something like ethane there will be. They can figure that out for themselves. And they're making their decision, I would guess, based on a combination of the appropriateness of the site. So is it expandable? Can you build the facility you want? Is it expandable? And it winds up that in the case of an ethane cracker, so for ethylene, what I understand they want in far as infrastructure is close, ready access to rail, road, and water for transporting. And they also want a friendly and predictable tax and regulatory environment. So when you look at all that stuff, we as a company can't really help them with any of that. And therefore they don't see any need to have conversations with us.
You talked about a couple minutes ago wet gas and dry gas. Marcellus Shale produces
Both.
both. Oh, okay.
In West Virginia, there is a dividing line. It's kind of an east-west, but it really might be more like gently northeast-southwest or northeast, south-southwest, I guess. Would that be a line? Such that, in the northern part of the state, basically to the west of that line, the natural gas that is produced from the Marcellus Shale has higher concentrations of natural gas liquids, therefore wet gas. And the natural gas to the east of that line is entirely methane.
And which is better for you to work with?
Right now, it's the wet gas because natural gas liquids, other than ethane, propanes and butanes, tend to have their prices linked to that of crude oil. And those prices, as you've probably noticed, are very high. An energy equivalence you can think about when you think about methane, of course it uses different units from crude oil, but to get an energy equivalency, you could take natural gas prices or methane prices the way they're priced, which is per million BTU, or actually per MCF, which is very similar, it's the unit volume. Multiply it by 6, and that's roughly gives you an energy equivalence with crude oil. So right now natural gas is priced at, let's say it's about $2.50. That would be the equivalent of $15 per barrel crude oil. And crude oil right now is trading, at least in the world markets, at $100 or north of $100. Yep. So now natural gas liquids typically sell at about 2/3 the price of oil on an energy basis. So you'd kind of look at that and say, well, would you rather sell it for the equivalent of $15 a barrel or for the equivalent of, let's say, $70 a barrel? And if we had a choice, we'd pick the 70.
Yeah, I can figure that out.
Though if you're West Virginia, you're thinking, it's not so bad that we're getting a lot of this inexpensive natural gas, because that can feed manufacturing businesses, petrochemical businesses, et cetera. But so for now, we are trying to concentrate on the wet gas. From a processing perspective, the natural gas that comes out of the ground in West Virginia is very pure. So if it's on the dry side, it doesn't need to be processed. It can basically, we remove water, but it can be sent basically straight into a power generation facility or into heating. So it's simpler. There's less investment required. But with today's prices, you'd rather go for the wet gas. And I think you're going to continue to see that.
Once upon a time, we thought we were going to move into gas-powered cars. We seem not to have done that. Now
I do have a prediction.
Talk about it again. There was a New York Times op-ed piece last week that said there is a need for us to move in that direction, and I believe EQT has just opened a
fueling station.
Fuel station. Where are we? What's your forecast on this one?
Because of the economic benefits and the air quality benefits, I think we will continue to see a steady but sure increase in the amount of our transportation fuel in this country that comes from natural gas. I don't think it will ever supplant gasoline or diesel, even though some have called for that, because, well, at least it wouldn't for many years into the future. But what we're already seeing in many parts of the country, our region, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, not being one of those, incidentally, but in many parts of the country, we are already seeing the use of natural gas as a vehicle fuel for vehicles that use a lot of energy and that tend to return to the same or a very few number of fueling stations. You think, well, okay, what would come to mind? Well, one big use is buses, especially the metro buses. So actually, just as some environmentalists get concerned about natural gas, I think they probably would find it intriguing that the most rapid and full adopter of natural gas as a bus fuel is Southern California. And so basically all 2,200 of their buses in LA County run on natural gas. At the fueling station you mentioned that we have in Pittsburgh, one of our folks was surprised to see that a couple of months ago, as he went by the site, which is, it's an unmanned site, you can see things by camera from remotely. And he looked at the site and was surprised as he drove by. There was a huge bus in the forecourt. And as he got closer, he saw that it was a brand new New York City Metro bus. So we went up and talked to the driver. That's how we get our information. It's very high tech. We go up and talk to the driver and say, what's going on? So, well, New York City has ordered some buses. They were built in Indiana, right? So not Japan or Germany. They were built in Indiana, and they're going to Manhattan. And we looked at the little websites and stuff like that, and we decided that the best place to stop was the EQT site in Pittsburgh. But since you folks allow the use of credit cards or purchasing cards and stuff like that, there was no need to contact anybody. We just drive up, you get there when you get there, you swipe your card, you fill up your bus. And I'm bus number 2 out of an order of 350. So 350 buses finding their way from, again, a manufacturing plant in Indiana to New York City. So buses are a big one. It winds up that the economics for waste trucks is very good also. Again, it's how much does it cost to convert? How many fueling stations do you need? Well, they tend to return to the same fueling station. And what's the energy usage? And incidentally, what we find with both the buses and the waste trucks is since they operate in urban environments, a lot of them do, certainly they operate around people, right? I mean, it winds up that the non-humans on the planet don't create as much waste that have to be picked up by the waste trucks, imagine that. So they tend to operate where there's a lot of people, and they have tended in the past to run on diesel, and the air quality is very poor. So it contributes to poor air quality. So they notice that you don't have those kinds of emissions with a natural gas vehicle. The only thing they've really had a hard time, actually a serious issue they've had to deal with, is they run so quietly that folks who aren't used to it sometimes aren't aware that they're operating. So you need to be, if you think it's stationary and it's not stationary, that could be a problem. So you do need to get used to that. But we also heard some stories on the trash side that some of the, and I guess it's largely, they're not entirely males who are doing that, actually would just say the folks operating the waste trucks would go home to at the end of the day, and their significant other would accuse them of playing hooky because they didn't smell. Because it winds up that you think, well, they probably smell. It's not actually from the garbage. It's because they're next to the diesel exhausts all day long. So they had to deal with skeptical significant others who thought, well, now how can you not smell when you come home?
But there's an incredible infrastructure that's necessary if you're going to have lots of gas-powered cars.
If it's going to be automobiles, I agree. So that's why I think what you need is a bootstrapping approach. You start with fleet vehicles, and the reason for fleet vehicles is you can get a whole bunch of conversions at once, right, with a handful of decisions, with a very few fueling stations. The fueling stations should have public access, so the people who do want to buy a vehicle, and there are many vehicles, there's not many passenger cars available that you can buy to use that use natural gas right now anyway. There's actually one, the Honda Civic Gx. So if you wish to go buy one, they announced, I think at the beginning of this year, or maybe it was last year, that as of now, the Honda Civic Gx is available in all 50 states, and it is manufactured, even though it's a Japanese car, and this is where the nameplate issue kind of can be misleading, but the Honda Civic Gx is manufactured in the United States. So you can buy that vehicle, but for the rest of them, basically you have to convert them from gasoline to natural gas.
This question, the person who wrote this question heard that answer before he wrote this question. Figure that out. But what % of electricity is from natural gas, and would changing fleet trucks really help?
It's, I believe, about 25% of electricity comes from natural gas.
I've seen
it's in the 20 to 25 range. The most prominent fuel in this country is still coal, then it's natural gas, then it's nuclear, and then you get into a variety of the others. And I'm not sure what the significance from the perspective of what would we infer.
Well, so the inference would be, if you think about environmental issues and is converting fleet trucks from gasoline to natural
fine.
gas.
You know what?
Is
I'm willing
it
to
gonna
make
save money, or
I'm
is it
willing to
good?
make a political statement. I think the most, other than economics, the best reason for converting the most likely vehicles to natural gas from petroleum products, and those would be the larger vehicles, is that it would be nice to not worry so much. I would find it nice to not worry so much about what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, I think
Have
it's
more control here.
a practical reality is that we get involved in the Middle East to protect our economic interests. And it's fine for us to criticize the first President Bush or the second one or President Obama, but at some level, as president, they are charged with looking out for the welfare of the country. And we are so dependent upon imported crude oil that I don't think it's unreasonable that they have defined their job such that they think we need to be paying attention to those embargoes, et cetera. It would just be nice to not have to. I mean, we could care about the Middle East for humanitarian reasons, et cetera, but to not feel we had to. And right now, we feel we have to.
Okay. This question comes from Earth Magazine. A study of wells, I can't read whether it's 68 or 18, wells within 1 kilometer of a Marcellus fracking operation found methane in 85% of them. An isotopic analysis indicated that the methane came from a deep source. Can anything be done about that, presumably leaking methane?
Well, most of the study, I haven't seen the study they've seen, but the federal government and the state governments have studied this issue extensively. And in this part of the country, there is naturally occurring methane in a lot of water wells. Because when they can do further chemical analysis to draw inferences about whether it comes from produced natural gas or naturally occurring. And again, the EPA, the current EPA, has concluded that based on what they know now, it seems as if it is naturally occurring methane. I mean, after all, that's how we found out methane, that natural gas even existed, right? It's not, I've great admiration for my fellow humans' innovative abilities, but the reality is most of our innovations come from observations, right? They begin with an observation, and then we decide we want to extrapolate, and we realize we have to learn more about what caused that which we've observed before we can extrapolate. And of course, some of it is just scientific curiosity. And it is from observation of natural gas in water wells coming to the surface, et cetera, that it made us realize there was natural gas at all. Same thing is true, of course, for oil. Matter of fact, there was one publicized example of, I think it was out in Colorado, of somebody lighting tap water on fire that came from a well. And then they wound up learning, that didn't show up in that particular documentary, but it wound up that the same farmer said, well, before they started drilling for natural gas here, I could also light my tap water on fire.
Another question.
But that said, if there are issues that we should establish, in my view, clear, scientifically based regulations around all industrial activities, and we should enforce those regulations consistently. I think that is the way we should treat natural gas drilling, the water handling around it, the transportation of it. It's the way I think we should deal with coal. It's the way I think we should deal with wind and solar and all forms of other industrial activities. And drilling for natural gas is an industrial activity. So it does need to be treated with those regulations.
Interesting question, is the Marcellus Shale history because it's being replaced with the Utica Shale?
I guess in a geologic sense it is history, because it was
Right.
No, I don't think so. It is the most economical dry gas resource in this country. So no, I don't think it's being replaced by the Utica. I do think if natural gas prices stay low and oil prices and natural gas liquids prices stay high, some of the shifting that we will see will be of drilling for dry gas in places like the Marcellus and elsewhere to drilling for wet gas, if you will, NGL-rich gas in the Utica. And even though there is, the Utica exists under parts of northern West Virginia and western Pennsylvania, it tends to be drier to the east in the Utica and wetter as you move west. And practically, that means the wet portion of the Utica is almost entirely, certainly primarily, in Ohio, and very little, if any, would be in West Virginia.
What percentage of gas goes to chemical feedstock? Does it vary by region? Does it depend on the makeup of the gas?
Well, for the most part, chemical feedstock comes from the natural gas liquids. And I don't have a percentage for you, but certainly a lot of natural gas liquids go to feedstock. But there hasn't been enough natural gas liquids in this country. So over the last 20 years or so, the reaction of the chemical industry in this country has been twofold. They have gotten more of their petrochemical feedstocks from refining crude oil, the so-called light end. So the lighter part of the crude oil, interesting, the lighter part of the crude oil is, in the lightest parts of the crude oil are equivalent to the heaviest part of wet natural gas. So they will get some of their feedstock from the refineries. Obviously, from the earlier part of the conversation, you can infer that that is a relatively expensive feedstock, and they have moved overseas. I think it was the head of one of the U.S. petrochemical companies who said, just a couple of months ago, the largest move of capital in the history of the petrochemical industry is the current movement from offshore U.S. to the U.S. And that's because that industry, by economic necessity, follows low feedstock costs. Now, as far as all natural gas, about 20 to 25% of all natural gas goes to industrial uses all up. So that would include chemicals, though, methane is mainly used in the fertilizer business. But that would be an example. I mean, I think I've heard that the regulatory issues around fertilizer plants is such that it is unlikely that we will construct a new fertilizer plant in this country. There might be expansions, but unlikely we would construct a new one. But a lot of fertilizer plants in this country were mothballed over the last 10 to 20 years or more, and they were moved offshore. And something that is going on at a furious pace is companies restoring those previously mothballed plants so that they can use inexpensive natural gas from the United States in their fertilizer, to make fertilizer.
You mentioned offshore work. The BP accident in the Gulf, did that set back the industry, or was that just a blip of an experience and isolated with regard to when and what caused it?
Well, of course, when I mentioned offshore for petrochemicals, right, I meant other countries. Right. I meant other countries. I didn't mean in the water.
Right. Okay.
The Macondo well, of course, was an oil well, so it's a little different. Oil is worse of a problem in water because it kind of sits there. I mean, that's natural gas. It wouldn't have been the same issue. We don't have any offshore activities at EQT, so all I can tell you is what I've heard is that at best there were inappropriate practices followed in that situation, and I think what has to happen is what is happening, which is you review the circumstances of that situation, punish the bad actors, review the regulatory regime, and fix it if need be. And I think industry should reasonably be expected to review and, if they need to, establish, as opposed to just review, industry best practices that are then reviewable by the regulatory agencies. And I believe that is all occurring. But it has to be true that there was laxness on the part of the individuals involved, and it appears from a distance that there was laxness on the part of the regulators, and that's the industry capture issue that I mentioned before. With the money going directly into the MMS, I mean, we can't prove cause, right? We're up here speculating, but you just kind of wonder, is that a healthy arrangement? Wouldn't it be better for the money, because they make a lot of money. The federal government makes a lot of money from those offshore wells. Would it be better if that money flowed through Treasury as opposed to going directly to the MMS, so that MMS still has to go to Congress or someone else to get approvals for their budgets, and that there's some better oversight involved? But again, I read the same newspaper articles you do.
Shouldn't full disclosure include concentrations of fracking chemicals to protect first responders and the public?
Yes, with first responders, of course, that happens already. But yes, I absolutely believe that there should be full disclosure. The issue that we've had with disclosure in the industry is that a number of the oil field service companies have said that they're concerned that they would be revealing trade secrets to other companies, other countries, etc. Just so you know, the natural gas production companies are happy to disclose absolutely everything. And we are disclosing as much as we can. We've co-signed letters to the oil field service companies. We do mention concentrations as well as the individual constituent parts. What the struggle has been, that's the equivalent if you were cooking, not that I cook, but from what I read, from what my wife tells me. You have a shopping list or a recipe list, but the actual recipe then is how it was put together. And that's where the struggle has been. That's where the oil field service companies have said that's ours, that's proprietary information. But from our perspective, we're happy to have all of that disclosed, but that's where the issue has been. It hasn't really been on disclosing what's in there, how much, etc. And first responders do get more information than the public at large gets already.
Why should drilling, not storage, why should drilling be allowed in geologically sensitive areas? Hasn't earthquake risk resulted in a ban on drilling in Arkansas?
No, it was not. That is not accurate. No, it's resulted in a ban on storage wells, water disposal wells. It's just that if you can't dispose of the water, practically speaking, you can't drill. And as I said before, I agree with that. That's for any activity. I mean, we focus a lot on natural gas. In this state, I think you hear about a lot natural gas and coal. But somebody, I don't want to say who, but asked me, what do you know about these Indiana bats or these Kentucky bats? And of course, they're Indiana bats. Yeah. And it winds up that Indiana bats help protect agriculture. And the wind farms, including in this state, kill them by the thousands or the tens of thousands. I mean, they're nearly wiping them out, which will result, so we get wind power and we also get more pesticides in our food. And so is that a trade-off you want? And yet all they need to do is to not to put the wind towers up in certain areas, and during certain migratory periods, have the turbines be shut down for just a couple of hours in the middle of the night. So just as I think they should make those tweaks to what they do to protect the environment, natural gas companies should also adapt what we do to protect the environment. I also don't like the idea of drilling close to aquifers that serve big cities. Okay. I mean, whether it's Charleston or Pittsburgh or New York, if a city is getting its water from an aquifer, we don't want to be running a lot of risk. We don't even want to get unlucky with those. So I don't have any issue with the notion that if it's a sensitive area, we should steer clear. But we also shouldn't use it as an excuse for those who say, well, I've decided I don't like this activity, I don't like that activity, so I'm gonna try to say all of it's sensitive. Because realistically, for natural gas, I know the coal folks would say the same thing, that happens too.
What's the most important role of EPA in natural gas exploration and development, and how would you evaluate the role of government regulation of your industry?
Generally speaking, I think, and the industry typically believes also, that most day-to-day regulation is best accomplished at the state level because there's individual circumstances that occur that are different from one state to another. There's sensitive areas in one state that wouldn't be to another. So to pass rules that, just as when the speed limit went back up from, remember there were 55, we talked about the oil embargo, you and I did before this, and how that probably influenced some of my career choice of getting into energy. But as a follow-on to that, really was kind of between the oil embargoes, I guess. I believe it was President Nixon was in office when we passed a nationwide speed limit of 55. And then over time decided, well, maybe we should take a kind of a horses for courses approach. And we do that. And the same thing applies with regulation of industrial activity. I do think the EPA is the right place to perform the studies of our industry and others. If anything, the distressing thing for us is there's, I believe, about a dozen federal departments and agencies that are studying the natural gas business right now. And I'd much rather that the EPA headed up really all those studies, so it was done in a more coordinated fashion.
Okay. Talk a bit about prices. You talked about the dramatic decrease in price. Has that resulted, seems to have, in a reduction in production? And you think those prices are going to rebound, or are we now producing so much natural gas that we're going to keep those prices down?
I don't know that production has declined very much yet. It might be that it's starting to decline.
Aren't some people talking about taking rigs down? And
yeah, but they're moving into the other areas. For instance, when you drill for wet gas, most of what you get out of the ground is still methane. It's just that there's enough natural gas liquids to dramatically impact the economics. I do think we'll probably start seeing some, right around now, actually, when we look back on March of 2012, we'll see that some declines had begun. I don't think prices are likely to stay in this $2 range for a long time. They could certainly stay there for a year or more. I mean, obviously with a commodity, the price could be lower a month from now or 2 months from now, because the decisions that we make in a capital-intensive business have very long lead times. So they could drop some from here just because it's the nature of where commodities are. But I think at some point in the next 2 or 3 years, prices begin moving up some. The futures market suggests prices as you look out 4 or 5 years that are more like $4, maybe moving towards $4.50. So prices that start with a 4. In 2008, prices got up to north of $10, even $12 per unit. I don't see us really ever. It's not in the foreseeable future will prices get back to that level, because so many of these basins will be more attractive to drill if prices move up a bit.
Somebody wanted to know if selling natural gas internationally would be a strategy to get prices back up.
Well, there's moves afoot to do that. Just as back in the 70s, we were worried that there wasn't enough natural gas, so there were actually federal laws that were passed to restrict the use of natural gas so that we would preserve it as a home heating fuel. We had been in this country over the last several years constructing liquefaction facilities so that we could, well, really not liquefaction, but receipt facilities so that we could receive liquefied natural gas from other countries. Now those companies, whether it's on the Gulf Coast or the East Coast, there's I don't know that we ever really imported much into the Pacific Northwest. They're talking about exporting now. But now those facilities are madly trying to design, permit, and construct the much more complex liquefaction facility that is needed to take natural gas from the U.S. and export it. But I don't think the first of those is designed to come online until, geez, I'm thinking it's at least late 2015. And the nature of these construction projects is that, you know, they're not
forever.
Yeah. So I do think that's a good idea on the margin. I don't think it will ever account for a lot of the demand in the U.S., but I do think it's a good idea.
Two questions designed to, the second one to put you on the spot, but the first one isn't too bad.
You've done that all evening. What do you mean?
Oh, that's all right.
Okay.
Describe the operations of EQT in West Virginia, if you would.
We've got about 500 people. We invest several $100 million a year. Most of it is in drilling wells, but some of it, certainly well north of $100 million, say this year, is in pipelines and compressor stations, et cetera. In addition to the 500 people whose payroll is maybe a little north of $40 million. So it results from, even excluding their income taxes, we're paying several $1 million a year in taxes to state, county, et cetera. And just because of the nature of the business, there are hundreds of other contractors, with a lot of the numbers coming from the land function, many of which are contractor by nature of the business, but in many other areas as well. And we're also facilitating the building, even though we're not owning it, of processing plants. One in particular that's in the midst of being constructed now by a company called Mark West, but they are constructing it to process our wet gas.
Mm-hmm. The question I wouldn't ask myself, of course, is would you please compare and contrast doing business in West Virginia with doing business in Pennsylvania and Virginia and Kentucky?
It's the best place to do business.
When did you see the governor? Jeez, nicely done.
No. We had no asks of him. He's information gathering.
Oh, okay.
He's information gathering. But seriously, West Virginia has done a lot in the last, I'd say actually more than a couple of years, the last handful of years, to work better with business. I don't think they're cutting, my view is they're not cutting business any breaks. They've just realized that the best thing for the economy of West Virginia long term includes, the best future includes a healthy investment climate, and that means clear regulatory regimes and clear taxing regimes. And frankly, several years ago, that is not what West Virginia was known for. And I think West Virginia has become a lot more, and so in that sense, to me, business friendly doesn't mean light regulations or light taxing. To me, business friendly means clear regulations and clear taxing.
Predictability.
Predictability, exactly. We're making investments for many years. And good, bad, or indifferent, knowing what the rules are at the time we invest the money and hire the people is a lot better for us than finding out changes in the rules down the road.
Yeah. How long do you think there will be drilling in the Marcellus Shale and the Utica shales?
Well, whoever wrote that, I would say that when your children, if you're blessed enough to have them die of old age, we will still be drilling in the Marcellus.
How long would one of those wells continue to produce once you've drilled it?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I will tell you that EQT has wells, including in West Virginia, that have been producing since the 19th century. Now, they don't produce a lot anymore, in fairness. You know, there's a decline curve, but they still produce natural gas even now. So my guess, I guess, would be that they will still be producing in the, at least into the early 22nd century. And if I'm wrong about that, I'm happy for you to come see me.
Yeah. We have a well here on campus, so my successors thank you for your forecast. Since we have an abundant supply of natural gas in our area, will it cause an increase in manufacturing opportunities here?
I hope so, and I think so. I think that's it's just that we're just the supplier. So we don't have a lot of influence over that. I think that goes back to the regulatory and tax issues.
I guess I'd like for you to do some...
But historically it does. Historically, low energy prices leads to increased manufacturing, wherever you look in the world.
I guess I wanted you to think for a bit about this major conundrum that seems to face the country, if not the world. We have
the
growing...
NCAA playoff, I'm in favor of one. I think there's...
Yeah. Yeah,
a different one.
I'll stay out of gas, you stay out of education.
Okay.
No. There's this incessant demand for energy. We want more and more of it. As you said earlier, every manner of producing, method of producing energy has pluses and minuses. And there are people out there who oppose every one of them.
Yeah.
How in the world do we meet the demand? How in the world do we find ways to get permits to build plants and produce the energy that people want? I mean, where's this conflict going to end? What's ahead for us?
Well, as far as those who don't like any of the solutions, as long as they're prepared to accept very low economic growth, then I think that's at least an internally consistent view. I don't think that is good for the standard of living for any of us, but at least that view is a defensible view because they're saying, I am willing to make that trade-off. Over time, I think we need to continue to get more energy efficient, but we have, as a country, been getting more energy efficient. I would prefer personally, now this is a philosophical view, others will have different views. I would prefer that we do that by allowing the market to work. I recognize that the government at all levels needs to raise revenue. And was it Jack Kemp or was it Milton Friedman or somebody like that who said if you tax something, you will get less of it. If you subsidize something, you will get more of it. If this is what we were worried about because of the trade-offs of all these forms of energy production, I could certainly personally see, I'm not speaking for the company or certainly not for the industry, but I could imagine us moving towards a system where instead of taxing income and employment and things like that, we tax the things we want less of. So we tax emissions, et cetera. Not to raise more money, but just a different approach, and then that helps provide maybe a nudge. So instead of having all sorts of regulations, including, for instance, on fuel economy for cars, et cetera, that seems a very rough way to do it. If you wind up saying, no, I will raise the money by taxing, as long as you're willing to remove the taxes from the other stuff, because net, it should keep the revenue for the government flat, right? Because I don't think it's fair to say I'm going to increase revenue or decrease revenue just by the method of collection. But I personally could be comfortable with altering how we raise the revenue so that over time it will reflect the trade-offs that we think aren't being reflected in the current market. Does that answer your question?
Well, I'm going to come back to it in a second.
Okay.
Because that's the basis, the groundwork for how you view where we're going. You've talked a couple of times about energy independence. Mm-hmm. There's an argument on the other side that says the safest world is an interdependent world. And that if we become too independent, that we are increasing the fragility of the world, if you will. And that it's better for us to be relying on one another. How do you deal with that argument, or how do you respond to that argument?
Well, I have no problem with interdependent world. That doesn't trouble me. It's just that even as I'm sure there's some folks who think that coal and natural gas, and I just laid out an argument on wind, would say that they're not fully picking up their externalities. Right. Imported crude oil has inflated the defense budget. This is the very political view. Inflated the defense budget in this country by a lot. I've heard estimates that it's $100 billion a year, where if you could just imagine a world where we at least imported less. I mean, importing from Canada I don't think troubles me, but if we didn't have to import from the Middle East, I just think just as natural gas and coal, and we talked about wind, solar, there's the issue with where they put the panels, especially out in the land use. They use tremendous amounts of land, and that affects wildlife, et cetera, and folks want to affect that. Well, the same thing's true for crude oil. It's just that in that case, the externality that they're not paying for is showing up in having more ships or having them places where we wouldn't have to be, putting the lives of our young men and women in harm's way. And I think that's something that, price it in. Price it in.
As a summative question then, when you think about the future of energy supply, the needs that people have, not even to begin to think about India and China and emergent countries and the desires that they have, do you find yourself being optimistic about the country's capacity to resolve these issues and deal with them? And if you are optimistic, what is the root of that optimism?
Well, I'm optimistic about our energy resources in this country. I'm optimistic about our ability to solve technological hurdles, whether they have to do with environmental issues or energy efficiency. When I think about optimism about the country, it's, and again, that's my view, we probably gleaned some of this, I think the country as a whole would benefit from fewer, simpler rules.
Might we get there?
I hope so.
Okay, we'll let you off the hook. So thank you, David Porges, for coming to Charleston. Thank you for participating in the conversation. Thanks to all of you. See you in about 3 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.